Thanks, Kim. It's a real privilege to be here today, and the topic couldn't be more pertinent as fires are raging on parts of the planet like they never have before in California. This last year we've seen fires in places as diverse as France, Sweden, even the UK, large-scale fires. So this question that I was given caused me to ponder deeply, how will fire shape future landscapes? I am a person whose mind is untidy, and I draw mind maps, and they are disparagingly known in this university. Oh goodness me, we've got another Clarke horrendogram. So I will move on. That is going to be the horrendogram I'll build for you, and it's actually quite a tidy version of my mind, so I'll give it a crack. I'm going to try and start at basics and have a think about what are the key factors that influence fire and what does the future hold for them. Every fire needs a fuel. That fuel's going to accumulate at certain rates over time in a natural or man-made setting. It's going to vary in its flammability. It's going to vary in how it's connected, whether there's gaps between the fuels, and that will affect how far the fire spreads. It also is going to need an ignition source, be that a small boy with a box of matches, a DELP employee, a power line that blows in the wind. They're going to be a rain or a lightning strike. There's going to be ignitions. The nature of that fire in that landscape is going to be profoundly affected by the climate conditions prior to that ignition event. Was it a wet period? Was it a drought? And then on the day, when the ignition takes place, what are the prevailing weather conditions? And I distinguish climate from weather here. And that will determine the nature and extent of that fire. And fire ecologists like to speak of fire regimes with certain characteristics. And as we think about the future, we need to be thinking, are the characteristics of fire going to change, or are they going to continue as they have for millennia? And there's some really important aspects of those characteristics that are likely to change. A critical one for the biota is how often the fires occur. What's the frequency of fires? Is it once a century, or is it going to be once every decade? What's the gap between two successive fires? Interfire interval. When those fires occur, are they going to be cool fires like this one trickling along the ground in the Box Ironbark region near Rushworth, or are they going to be canopy consuming fires that change every stratum of the forest? And as a zoologist, I think it's really important to think about the extent of these fires. Is it going to be a 1 hectare little blaze? Or are we talking, as we are in California, of tens of thousands of hectares in a single event? And when that single event takes place, what's going to be the configuration of that fire? Is it going to be uniform across the landscape, or is it going to be patchy? Are there going to be unburnt parts? Are there going to be less burnt parts? And all of those characteristics come together to make a fire regime. The biota, or the landscape level response, is not just going to be affected by the nature of the fire, it's going to be affected by a whole bunch of other, what ecologists will call drivers. Primarily one of them is the fire conditions after the fire and before. Did this fire happen after a drought or after a wet year? When it happened, what was it followed by? Was it followed by a dry period again, or above average rainfall? Or as my favourite part of the universe, Wilson's Promontory, which got burned in 2005, it snowed on Mount Oberon a month later. What a weird combination of driving events. So when we think about the impact of a fire regime on a landscape, on its vegetation, it may be a minor perturbation of the structure of the vegetation, or it may be a stand replacing impact. And I've been trying to think about what do we know about the life history attributes, the characteristics of the organisms that populate this landscape, and how is that going to change? So really fundamental basic things like, how long does it take this Banksia to produce enough seed to replace itself? And we might have historic data that says, okay, Banksia serrata, after, I'm making this up, after 8 years, might set seed sufficient to replace itself if the adult got killed. But what if? What if the climate changed so profoundly that it now takes 16 years for Banksia serrata to set seed to replace itself? And we change the fire frequency in a way that puts a fire in that landscape before that banksia has set seed to replace itself, well, it will become locally extinct. They're the things that were running through my head as I got given this very big question: what's the future landscape going to look to, and what's going to be the role of fire in that? The very attributes that the animals and plants depend on may themselves be changing before our eyes, and as a consequence, the biota that makes up that landscape itself could change, and I'm going to give you some examples of that. Some ecological processes might change. So in this forest, one of Andrew's students has been studying yellow-footed antechinus that need hollow trees or logs to den in or to breed in. Could it be that the rates at which hollows and logs rot, the activity of fungi and of termite that produce hollows, might change? Whereas it might take 100 years in the past to have produced a hollow, what's going to be the rate of hollow production naturally in that landscape in the future? Ecological processes. And are we talking about the recovery of those landscapes in lovely, neat, successional patterns that every ecologist was trained to celebrate? Or are we talking about whole shifts to a completely different vegetation type because we've tipped some balances? So, again, back to my favourite part of the universe, Wilson's Promontory. So we can look as an ecologist and say over time and celebrate the extraordinary recovery power of these landscapes as they come back after fire. And that's fabulous, and we're very fortunate to have them be able to do that. But we can also tip them. This is the south part of Wilson's Prom, near South Peak, and it copped 3 fires in quick succession: 1932, 43, 51, and then the fire I've been studying, 2005. And as you can tell, that was a forest. It was a eucalypt forest, but if you look at it from the air, there are chunks of it which have now been denuded from eucalypts. That's quite an achievement in Australia. To eradicate eucalypts from a landscape is quite an achievement. And that's what this landscape looks like now. And you can see the last stag of the big forest that was there. And since the 1950s, that has been a thicket of scrubby acacia, cassinia and bracken. So if we push it, we can turn it down a completely different trajectory. And it's anybody's guess as how many decades, possibly centuries, it will take for these eucalypts to recolonise that. Because when you burn it, as we did in 2005, the acacias come back thicker than ever. There is not a place for a eucalypt to get a foothold. So we can, here's my bottom bit of my herendogram, we can have an arrow back here that on that site you can see has changed profoundly the nature of the fuels on that site. They're not all big foresty trees anymore. You've got a really dense thicket of fire-loving acacias. Bring on the next fire and they come back thicker than the hairs on a dog's back. On top of that, so that's the natural picture I guess is natural, use that word carefully, but that's a picture of how the landscape might do its thing, interacting with climate as it's done for millennia. If we then on top of that recognise that we have occupied the whole planet and changed the planet and its climate, what's the likely impact of that going to be? And I'm not going to attempt a global, I'm not even going to attempt an Australia-wide. I'll go to a bit of bush I know, which is in the Mallee, and what the predictions of the climate scientists are for the Mallee. Close to a doubling of really bad fire days is the best predictions people have got by 27. So days above 40 degrees each year, up from 6 to about 11. What's that going to mean for all those fire characteristics? What do we know? We think precipitation's going to drop in this part of the world, so the dryness of fuels will change. Fuels are really hard to predict under climate change in this part of the world. They may go down in the rate of accumulation, but they might be drier. What's going to happen to lightning strikes in this part of the world? Are they going to go up? And how many days of severe weather? Well, we're told that's going to be going in that direction. We know in parts of this state we've got whole tipping points where we have had state change. So this is part of the Alps where there's been 3 fires since 2003 and alpine ash has been eradicated, unless we put it back, from whole hillsides. So we've got signs that we are looking at different landscapes, or that we may want to make value judgments and say we need to intervene here If we want alpine ash forests, perhaps we have to do something more than sit back and watch and see what happens. So if we summarise that, so climate change is clearly going to affect ignitions. It's going to affect the lead up to the ignition point. It's going to probably have profound effects on accumulation rates and flammabilities and connectivity. The predictions are fairly grim for the weather conditions and bad days in many parts of the world. And then we have to think about what's the likely impact of these changes on the biota themselves in terms of the conditions they're going to face after the disturbance event of the fire. But then on top of that, we need to also try and hold together the sociological. And so we are also out there changing landscapes, and our expectations of the landscapes are changing. So in this slide, if we've got parts of the state, and particularly parts of Tasmania, as the vineyards move south with climate change, people who might have used landscapes for grazing have now invested massive amounts of infrastructure to grow a different crop. With that change in use of the landscape will come different expectations of governments and neighbours on how they control fire. Whereas a fire might have gone through a paddock of grass, and you might have had stock losses, the paddock will respond in months and you'll have grass again. Not so in a vineyard. You've lost your trellising, you've lost years of investment. And so with that, the owner of the vineyard may well have very different views about fires in them there hills. They might have very different views about what's acceptable levels of fire around them, even what levels of smoke is around them, because that wine we're so very fond of gets smoke tainted. So I want to be safe. I don't want my wine to be smoke tainted. Just keep me safe. Tricky space to fill. When we go from cereal crops to almonds, our expectations may profoundly change about what we think is acceptable levels of fire in the landscape. As we spread out into rural landscapes, and that's going to be the topic of the next talk, I believe, our ideas about what's an acceptable level of fire will change with that. And as we have the most, I think it's declared this week, we're the most affluent society. We have the highest median income in the world. And so we have sometimes lifestyle properties, and we built those assets amongst very flammable landscapes, and we have expectations of how safe they can be or not. If we think at the ecological level and we fragment the landscape, some of these little patches are going to experience fire regimes like they've never experienced before, possibly through the exclusion of fire. So if we take a patch like this that's surrounded by probably valuable crops, the chances of a big fire, a canopy consuming fire being allowed to occur in that woodlot here are very remote. Even if that was part of the natural fire regime, a fire is really very unlikely to get there. So we'll be making all sorts of decisions like that. So land use change is going to affect ignitions. We're going to have many more small boys at the peri-urban area with boxes of matches. That may change ignition rates. We're going to have power lines over more of the landscape. Some places are going to accumulate fuels at different rates because we're not going to allow fire that close to human habitation. And undoubtedly fire regimes are going to change. And these two factors, climate change and land use, are going to interact. Reinforcing earlier speakers, what we actually do with that, how we respond as a society is going to be interesting. And it's not all about ecology and what we discover here or we understand over time. It's this collision of our knowledge with our values. What we decide as human beings across the landscape are things we care about, and whether we convey that to the people we elect and whether they impose rules on the landscape. And we saw that in Victoria after the Black Saturday Royal Commission. A major policy shift came in where the government decided that it was necessary to burn fuel reduce 5% of public land per annum. So we can have these big lever shifts in response to a loss of values, and I think it'll be fascinating in California when you've even got the president buying in and telling the foresters they don't know how to manage things. Absolute asset. Anyway, I should move on. I'm concerned about this collision and what it means for my grandson, and I take the point of others, of our historian telling us I should be thinking beyond that, but it does focus the mind somewhat. And we've talked about what possible responses, and I've seen this range of complacency when it comes to fire. Just about every brochure you read in every national park in Australia says fire is a natural part of the Australian landscape. Great. It's a little bit more complex than that. We can be reactive and panic, and I would say the Royal Commission 5% rule was a bit of that, and it was interesting how the neighbouring states adopted it immediately as well. In New South Wales and South Australia. Was it a good thought? Well, the government's moved away from that now, so I think that's a good thing. Or we can be proactive and adaptive, and I guess that's what excites me most about the Centre for Future Landscapes. Can we think about these things ahead of time? Can we make some choices? So to finish, I want to just have some ideas about engaging for the future, because I think it's challenging. At the top of my list is vigilance. We actually need a population that can recognise signs. Capable, and that's what I absolutely love about being at a university. You influence people's training. We are not in Kansas anymore. We need people who, for example, in the mallee, could recognise buffel grass. If buffel grass gets in the mallee, that's going to change the fuel load in ways that are going to be diabolical. How many of the population could even recognise what buffel grass is? So I guess this vigilance, we need folk like I'm sure that are in this room who are sensitive to know the times are changing, and this one we need to have a think about. I think we need to base the conversation in honesty and be really clear in our communication with the public. And we're not always very good at that, and I'm going to do a test for you, indulgence. We do a lot of planned burning in Victoria. He's going to hold up a sign at me in a minute. We do a whole lot of planned burning in Victoria. How much safer on a percentage scale do you reckon you're made by all the planned burning that takes place in the state? Because the agencies have quantified this, and I'm just interested if the public has a feel for it. What do you reckon the average person think, how much safer if we did none versus the planned? How much do you reckon we're reducing the risk? Any guesses? 2 minutes, right, okay. Think on it, because this is the published data. This is what Victorian government says they anticipate, and this is the residual risk, and I haven't got time to explain what that is, but this is the prediction over the next few years if we burnt nothing. Our risk will go up to about 78% chance of houses getting lost. If we do 230,000 hectares delivery, which is the most, we can keep it down to about 60. So with all that effort, the government's best estimate, the agency's best estimate is we could reduce the risk of fire by about 18%. I don't reckon the general public, I think they've got much higher expectations than that. You do all this stuff and we'll make you at least half as risky that you are now. But that's the best estimate. So I think we need to be frank about these things and have informed conversations and acknowledge what we don't know, that we've got lots to learn, lots to work out, and make a commitment to find out. I think we need to have courage to start doing what we already know is right. Landscape ecologists can tell us that preserving connectivity is really, really important to give our landscapes resilience, so that we can foster movement of organisms across the landscape. And I want to finish with a positive story that was a learning thing for me, and I promise I'm finishing. This is we were encouraged, Andrew did the same, said he starts where he lives. This is where I live, this is my suburban street. And a local conservation group convinced me to put up a few possum boxes in my house, in the front of my yard, and said, you need to convince your neighbours to put up a couple as well. And I said, very good, we'll give it a crack. These are possum boxes designed for sugar gliders. I'd lived there 26 years, never seen a sugar glider in my life. Within a month we had a family of sugar gliders. They were there somewhere in the landscape, they found those nest boxes in a month. We can do things if we choose to, and I think we need the courage to act, we need the courage to question, to experiment, to evaluate, and to make mistakes, to learn, and to be flexible. And that's the thing that excites me about this new centre. Thanks very much.